Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Gaye Adams Massey, CEO of YWCA St. Paul. And on behalf of the entire YW team, I'd like to welcome you to this equity and justice conversation on health and well-being. On this historic inauguration day, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. The topic we're discussing tonight, the impact of racism on health and well-being, is incredibly complex, and it can really be explored from multiple perspectives. We're not going to focus on disparities in healthcare, though, today. We're really looking at the enormous impact that the environments where we live, work, and play can have on our overall health. For example, we know that growing diversity in our workplaces has brought new talents, ideas, and opportunities. But we also know that many organizations that welcome and recruit for this diversity often don't know how to welcome it, how to create inclusive and equitable environments that welcome people from diverse backgrounds and make it possible for everyone to contribute at an optimal level. There's often little recognition that change is needed to create environments that are healthy for everyone. So this raises the question, what can we as individuals and organizations do to help build authentically inclusive and equitable environments that result in healthy outcomes? And when we don't work to build these environments, what toll is taken on our health and well-being? To help address these and many more questions, we are so fortunate to have Anika Ward, founder of Sankofa Leadership Network and YWCA St. Paul board member, here with us tonight. For over 20 years, Anika has worked to improve outcomes for youth and families through partnerships that leverage the power of community voice, vision, and leadership. She spent her career working to advance initiatives in education, art and science, workforce development, community health, and well-being. Before founding Sankofa Leadership Network, she served as the Senior Director of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota's Center for Prevention. Her work has impacted community groups, nonprofits, museums, state and local government, and healthcare organizations across the region. She's a daughter of the historic Rondo neighborhood here in St. Paul, and her work and approach really reflect the values she recognizes in community leadership and representation. So Anika and I are going to get the conversation started. After our discussion, we're going to move into virtual meeting rooms so that each of you has an opportunity to exchange ideas and experiences. Then we'll come back together for further discussion. Throughout our conversation this afternoon, the Zoom chat will be available for questions and comments. If time allows, we will come back and answer those questions. So thank you for being with us, here with us today, Anika, and for the important work you do in our communities. So to get us started, you know, we hear a lot of talk now about diversity, equity, and inclusion and how important it is. But I think it might be helpful to the folks here if you could just walk us through the differences in the definitions of diversity, equity, inclusion.
Absolutely, Gaye. Thank you so much for having me on, to you and the entire staff of the YWCA. I was thrilled to be invited in to join you in this conversation today. You know that I'm a huge fan of the YWCA and your work. The organization's work, the team's work. As a board member, I get to hear some pretty amazing stories, and I'm just grateful to be a part of the community with you. Also, I know pre-pandemic that my father spent probably the majority of his days, spent some time pre-pandemic in the pool and on the weights or at least he says, you know, playing with the weights, as he calls it. So it's a place that I value, that my family values. So thank you so much. So I want to be clear too, that in my role and in the roles that I've had, I don't consider myself by any means an expert on health and on health disparities, but I've had experiences and been in spaces from community health to education, you know, and to government, in so many spaces that I feel like I've got a wealth of stories and perspectives, lessons to share. And so, you know, in my most recent conversation, in my most recent role that you mentioned, Gaye, I started practicing grounding the conversation in about equity, diversity, and inclusion, not just in justice, like overall, not just in what's right overall, but in, you know, what's right for our health and what's right for our wellness. And as I started to have those types of conversations, it resonated very strongly with me and very strongly with some of the folks that I've worked with. And so I appreciate the space to have that conversation. And then my definitions are by no means the dictionary definitions, but I'll share with you and offer what some of the things that I've used in terms of definitions. And they're not too far off from the dictionary definitions. So diversity from my perspective is simply the presence of difference. And so when we look on, as I'm looking on the call and the faces on the screen today, I assume based on who I see in the room, that there is the presence of all kinds of differences that we represent, from where we live, to who we live with, to skin color, to age, to, you know, the types of families we live in. And so the presence of that difference, or at least as we think of it in the workplace, the assumption that I can look around and assume that there's the presence of difference. That's the way we talk about diversity. So the presence of difference is kind of the simple definition that I use for diversity. So much that, like, if you look at a crayon box, you know, and you dump out a bunch of crayons, if they're all reds, you have no diversity. If they're multiple colors, you have diversity, but the crayons aren't speaking, the crayons aren't, you know, you see them all the same, right? So that's diversity. Inclusion, from my perspective, is really about being clear about who's valued, whose voices, whose experiences, whose perspectives, whose needs are centered in the space, because someone's is. In every organization, someone's voices, perspectives, experiences are being centered. And so you should know who that is and be very intentional. You know, as we're leading in spaces and communities and organizations, it's important that we're clear who we're centering, and who's provided a sense of ownership and power. So who feels they have power, who feels they have authority, who feels they have a sense of ownership and even a sense of responsibility. That's inclusion. And that's a more intentional way of engaging in this D&I conversation, the step toward inclusion. And then from the way that I see equity is really more about ensuring that all those groups, all that difference that you see, that you've invited in and ensured are centered, their needs and their expectations, their perspectives are centered, ensuring now a step further that each of those groups have equal access to opportunities, to the resources, to the benefit, to the value that we produce in our organizations, in our communities, et cetera. So each of those groups have equal access to positive outcomes. And so whether we're in health, education, safety, economic opportunity, each one of the groups that we are prioritizing has equal access. So when we look across our businesses, when we look across our nonprofits and government organizations, government institutions, it's a very similar conversation about who's benefiting, who's not benefiting from our businesses, from our services, from the economic opportunities that come from, that are produced by our work. So we're hiring, we're spending money, we're doing business with someone is getting, some groups, some populations are getting great service and great value. And so, you know, that's to me what this discussion is about, being very clear about who that is and ensuring that it's that it's equitable.
You know, it's the way you laid that out is really clear and I think simple to understand. I think what gets harder is for people to visualize how to build inclusive environments. I mean, many organizations have cultures or ways of doing things that have kind of been in place for a long and have been successful for them. So can you talk to us just a little bit, Anika, about how we go about building an inclusive environment? But maybe before you even go there, I want to invite you to just chat with us a little bit about what happens when environments aren't inclusive and equitable. How does that affect those folks who aren't, to use your word, who aren't valued or centered in the space, or who feel that ownership and power and responsibility? If you aren't in that group, how does that tend to impact people who don't feel that inclusion in a workplace, or other environments?
So again, from my perspective, we show up as people, period. And I speak for myself as a woman, as a Black woman, in all the different identities that I hold. I feel like I often show up in spaces that are not prepared to hold. They're prepared to hold my diversity. There's a lot of spaces that welcome the diversity in appearance, the visual diversity, but there hasn't been a level of work that's been done to hold and center, those needs and perspectives, experiences that I come with, that I, have inherited as a part of the communities that I have developed and grown in. And so when we get into these systems, we get into our businesses that we work for, the communities, the schools that our children learn in, we end up realizing that not only do we enter a system that's not prepared to support, we don't see people who look like us, we don't see people and feel the culture that we come from present in those spaces. We don't see the culture that we come from or the culture that we show up, the frames that we show up in, valued and nurtured in those spaces. And so what I find is that we end up showing up in spaces either pretending, like we choose oftentimes that we have to pretend, and we're playing a game. We're playing someone else's game and trying to be better than them at it, right? And so that's one choice that we make. And you hear people talk all the time about that. Or then, we also show up in a way that, like some of us, where we decide to strategize and conspire to change the system, to exert pressure and influence on the system, and to build alliances to shift the system, to make it work. And then the other thing that I see happen is that we just choose to fight. We get to a point where we realize the system is not changing unless I make it. And so either of those ways of engagement, I used to, pride myself on being able to exert pressure and influence within the system in a graceful way, I thought. And I felt really productive at being able to do that. But in my opinion, what I've seen, and I coach tons of women, tons of people of color, and executive leaders even. And what I found is either one of those approaches within systems that are not prepared for us are dysfunctional. They become dysfunctional. And so we inevitably start to spend our energy either trying to make ourselves fit in with a system that doesn't fit for us. I had an elder tell me that one day. I went to a community meeting and I sat at Golden Time, coffee shop, maybe 12 years ago. And I said, I wish that meetings at my institution felt like this. And he went off on a tangent, and he said, it never will. Those systems were not made for you to be successful or healthy in. And he said, one day you'll come back to community and you'll notice these things that you won't like, but that's not one of them. You will feel nurtured, you'll feel, and that's just, we get to create the systems within our community oftentimes that fit what our needs are. But when we're trying to work and show up in a system that's not prepared for us, it hurts. And so we go home exhausted. There's an impact on us, there's an impact on our families. We go home exhausted, we're burned out. We're not our best selves for our families and our communities. And we also know chronic stress contributes to these unacceptable rates of preventable disease and premature death in our families and communities. And we know that this is part of that. The fact that we're going to work day after day after day and fighting or trying to make something fit that doesn't, it hurts. And then for businesses, they fail. It's a failure for us oftentimes, for the people who show up in systems that aren't prepared for us. And it's a failure for them. And so their work to diversify fails in different ways because we might stagnate, we might leave oftentimes. I have a friend and colleague named Kasim Abdur Razak, who's a licensed clinical social worker, who talks about this from a scientific perspective, the way that, I think of it as the science of inclusion and the science of exclusion, and what's happening to us inevitably, mentally, emotionally, and even physically, as we try to show up in one of these ways, either changing ourselves for the system or changing the system to match what our needs are.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about this. I know I've experienced exactly what you're talking about myself. And I remember early in my career, the definitions of success I had didn't align. I'm telling my age, but when I first started practicing law, there just were not many women in those settings, not to mention Black women. And so trying to fit in, trying to be successful in the way it had been defined was really a struggle. And I think most women had to come to the conclusion, particularly Black women, you had to do this the way that worked for you. Those models just did not fit. So I really appreciate that. Something else you said really struck me, that some of the places that welcome diversity, want diversity, are trying to recruit for diversity, but haven't built inclusive or equitable environments to nurture, support, and benefit from that diversity. When you talk with folks who recognize that in their spaces, what's your advice on how to go about building more inclusive environments?
So one of the things you said, Gaye, I think is the first place to start is your definition for success. So I think, so we're talking about leadership, the point at which we think that we can influence the system to make it work for more people. That's when we're stepping in and owning our ability to lead, our ability to influence. And that takes a certain level of agency, that takes a certain level of a sense of privilege and power. And so I always say the first step is to give yourself, figure out what you need to do to allow yourself to step into that sense of power. And for me, that's and the people that I coach, that's oftentimes thinking about who you are, identifying who you are separately from this institution, because sometimes we get, we get brainwashed into believing that our identity is stuck in that institution. But pull it out and decide what that identity is. Who are you? What is your vision for your life, your career? What are the values that you will always operate under, regardless of the system that you're in? What are the strengths, assets, values that you have to offer to the organization? Define that and decide that you are a package, and if you can get to the point, because some people just, are not in a situation where they can feel like they have that sense of agency. But if you can then get to the point where you decide that you will be well, and being well is more important than being successful in the way that the institution defines success for you. And that success is about being economically well, but about marrying that with your health and wellness, your family's health and wellness. And then you design a plan for how your life is going to look that aligns to your expectations. Then you overlay the institution that you're in over that and see, does it align? And you make a choice. If it aligns and it can provide the space for you to live and engage in the way that you need to achieve what success feels like for you, then you show up and you know that you're a leader, you know that you have impact, you know that that you have the ability to influence, and you start to define what that influence is. And when you decide to influence, it's a matter to me of recognizing, number one, you know, what I just described is to me the first step in leadership, just identifying calling out your identity as a leader. The second step is starting to identify the structure and the systems that you work within, that you have the ability to influence. So there's institutional strategy, there's tactics, or if you work in a space where you're not a manager, there are tactics and strategies that you operate within, and you have some sense, some ability to influence the practices, the way that those play out, and decide and identify what you can do to shift systems. Because, you know, you need a strategy and you need a culture of inclusion in order to make change happen. So you have to have both. So part of it is also building the culture of equity. If you are in a leadership position, then you've got to know the ways, you've got to identify the things in your culture, in the organizational culture, that make you feel like you can't breathe, that make other people feel like they can't breathe. The things that make new people feel like they don't belong, or people, so a lot of us, I have a lot of conversations with people of color who could tell you exactly what those things are, the microaggressions that happen throughout the day, and start to think about how you can influence some of those things by calling them out specifically. Or there's, language that we can use to influence, but not a full call out. There's ways we can influence people. There's ways we can pull people to the side. And then start to think about accountability. How do you build in accountability for yourself? How will you check in with yourself at the end of the day to know that the ways that you've engaged have created space for other people to be welcomed and included? How will you, keep yourself in that mode throughout the time you're there? And then the final piece is self-care. So how do you, knowing that this is exhausting, because at that point you've chosen to work within the system to put pressure and influence on the system to change in a strategic way. So know that means that requires something out of you. And so where are your boundaries that you will set for yourself so that you can, at the end of the day, that's my motto, that my theme that I got that I created for myself when I started working in health, in community health, was at the end of the day, we're all going to go home healthy. And so in every engagement with my team and every engagement with people I disagreed with, my goal was to engage in a way that didn't send them home unhealthy. So at the end of the day, the way that I rated my own engagement, I evaluated my own engagement was, did I engage in that way? And did I engage in a way that held some boundaries for myself that would allow me to go home healthy?
Well, what you're talking about is how strategies for how you can be authentically yourself in environments that weren't structured for you, which is so important for all of us to have those kinds of strategies when we're in places that weren't designed for us. One of the things you said really struck me about how you engage with others, because many of us are very supportive of diversity, but when we're honest, it's way more work to connect and effectively team with people who think differently, who come from different backgrounds, because you don't have that shared experience or shared background that makes it easier to connect and communicate. So doing that extra work, I think, is something that people have to acknowledge, because we need to think about how we shift our ways of engaging to ensure that our impact on ourselves and on others contributes to equitable and healthy spaces. Sometimes when you want an inclusive culture, but then you're working toward that, it can get uncomfortable. How do you talk with the people you coach about how you push back past that discomfort and really continue to stay focused on making the environment you're in more inclusive and more equitable?
I start off one thing. So I joke with I have 3 daughters and 1 son, and I joke with my daughters that when you're dating someone, make sure that they see the just raw, ugly side of you. Just show them quickly, so that it's not a long, so that you and them can figure out very quickly and not engage too deeply before what's going to be hard about the situation, right? That's my thing. Like, hurry up and get to know each other. Make sure they see. Don't hide the ugly. And so part of what I try to do, I do that with hires, with people that I hire. They always tease me later, like, Anika just must have thought that we weren't going to get along, because she kept saying, if this works out, if this relationship works out, then but I tell them a lot of things that they may or may not, that's hard about me, that's difficult about me. So as you step into a conversation about equity, diversity, and inclusion, it's important to me that everybody knows that it's hard and that it takes a long time. And then I can show you there's some things that you can do that are easy, quick wins. But this is not about a quick, easy win game. It's a long-term, engagement that you're in. There's a image that I like to show that's like a Pinterest image or something, but it's with a Maya Angelou quote, and I'm gonna mess up the quote, so forgive me. But it's something like, everyone marvels at the beauty of the butterfly, but we are not as quick to recognize and to think about how hard and how the work that it took to get there and the difficulty of getting there. And I try to remind people that, like, that inner work is ugly. Like, it can feel ugly, but it's actually beautiful, beautiful, important work that we're doing on the way to this beautiful vision. So articulate a vision so that you can see what that beautiful, image is. And know that when you're inside the ugly, the tough stuff, that it's on the way, you're making progress towards that vision. Because it's also cute on the other side of it, when you're not even doing the hard work. We can pretend to be doing really well. The other thing, that I've noticed, so I used to work I started off my career in African and African-American communities. I had 2 nonprofit jobs, between them maybe about 12 years. And then I moved into working in traditionally white spaces with diverse communities of color within populations of color. And what I started to realize, I love working with my people, like in the Black community, but I also recognize, like, my people is a broad, group of people with broad differences. And as we engage and we start to, the first thing when you bring diverse perspectives together is that you'll notice more conflict. And so it leads us to want to go back to, let's just pretend we're all the same and go back to just honoring diversity in vision, but not in engagement. And when you do that, you cause more dysfunction and poor health. When you lean in, it feels painful a little bit. When you lean into the discourse, when you lean into the conflict that results. But if you stay engaged and commit to respect, commit to the same vision. So we've articulated a vision and we stay on that conversation. We've articulated values together and we stay in alignment to those values, even when we disagree. We learn how to, and I'm saying this from experience, my first experience with that was at the Science Museum. We built this team that was full of diverse perspectives, opinions, religion, etc., skin color. And we learned how to gracefully disagree. And then we created this incredibly, we still call ourselves the dream team, this team of diverse people who could do conflict really eloquent, like really smoothly. We would face each other and struggle with each other and leave with the same respect we came in with for one another. And we got smarter. We were smarter. We had more trust and more confidence from the communities we worked with, which ultimately led to us feeling really good about ourselves and naming us the dream team, having the nerve to name ourselves the dream team. And then all of that led to actually more resources coming in for the programs we loved and cared about. And so I just say that because, should you choose to step fully into that work, there are some rough spots, and then there's something on the other side of that that is more valuable and incredible than ever. And then that starts to power our work to be diverse and inclusive, because people hear about us. People want to work for us now and with us. Families hear about us, funders hear about us. And that experience just showed for me and illustrated for me the value and the power of staying engaged and stepping forward with one another.
There is so much we could explore here, Anika. We could talk about this forever, but I think we've given our audience here enough to chew on a little bit. So now we're going to move into small group breakouts. Each breakout room is going to have an assigned YWCA staff person who's going to moderate and pose the same questions to every group. You'll be automatically sent to the breakout groups for about 15, 20 minutes. And when time is up, you'll automatically be returned to the main group. So take this conversation into your smaller breakouts. And then when we come back, we'll have more to share with each other. So I'm going to ask Shannon to move us into breakouts. Wonderful. I hope everyone had a really good conversation. I'm going to ask our YW staff members. Oh, wait, we still have some more folks coming back in. Give everybody a chance here. Welcome back. Welcome back. Just hope everybody had a chance to have some good conversations. I'm going to ask the YW staff folks who took notes and moderated your conversations to do just a brief report out on some of what you discussed so that the larger group can get a flavor for that. I'm going to ask Rakisha if she can report first for her group. Rakisha, you're muted.
Hi, there we go. So the first question was, what are some words and feelings that was resonating with our guests? Some people said lack of understanding, burnout, self-care. Some said articulating a vision and recognizing burnout, change. What are some experiences of showing up to a space not structured for you? And what was the impact on your well-being? There were a few people who expressed about making sure that you want to be in the environment that you are hidden in, such as walking into an interview, being prepared to be interviewed, but also interviewing the organization that you are applying for to make sure that that space is for you. And another thing that someone had spoke on is not every space is for you unless they felt that you built it yourself. She actually said she didn't feel comfortable in too many spaces unless she built it from the ground or if it was her own home. Some of those words was just like being exhausted, that how it impacted them, were exhausted, burnt out. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Rakisha.
You're welcome.
Melissa, can you share?
Holly and I actually switched. So
okay. So
yeah,
Holly, report?
Yes.
Holly? Make sure you unmute.
Can you guys hear me with my background noise?
Yeah.
Okay. So basically the people in our group felt like I'm sorry, lost my train of thought here. One person stated that they feel uncomfortable in their space when someone's inquiring about where they're from. Perhaps because they have an accent, they immediately ask where they're from, versus, getting to know who they are first, asking what their name is. Other ones felt uncomfortable, again, being in a workplace, being in an environment where it's predominantly perhaps Caucasians and they're the only Black. Yeah, I'm sorry. That's kind of the same thing.
Okay, great. Well, group 3, Kateri.
Yeah, so we had pretty good, I feel like, descriptions of what people were feeling, primarily focused a lot on the workplace